Let's make this simple. No politics, no sides, no excuses. Do you support this war or not? Because right now, millions are choosing, not after deep research, not after intelligence reports, but in seconds, based on headlines, based on emotion, based on what feels right. And that might be the most dangerous part. Because once you pick a side, you stop asking why. The official reason sounds clear. National security, stop a nuclear threat, protect allies. It feels logical, necessary, and for many, that's enough. But here's where it cracks. Even among analysts and intelligence voices, there's no full agreement on how immediate that threat really was. Not zero, but not certain either. And that gap matters more than people realize. Some reports say Iran was getting closer, that waiting could make things worse. Others point to something uncomfortable. Intelligence isn't perfect. Assessments shift. Certainty often comes after decisions. So now you're left with a question that has no clean answer. Was this necessary prevention or a decision made before the full picture was clear? Meanwhile, back home, the public isn't as certain. Recent polls show most Americans just want this war to end, even if goals aren't fully met. Think about that. Not victory, not dominance, just an end. So now there's a gap between what's happening and what people actually want. And gaps like that don't appear for no reason. So here's the uncomfortable part. If the threat isn't fully agreed on, and the public isn't fully behind it, then why does it keep moving? Why does it feel like the decision was already made before the debate even began? And maybe the real question isn't whether this war is right or wrong, but whether you were ever given the full picture to decide at all. Because once you see what's really driving this, you won't look at war the same way again. Every war starts with a reason. At least, that's what we're told. A threat, a line crossed, a moment where action feels unavoidable. And here, the reason sounds familiar. National security, stop a nuclear escalation, protect stability. On the surface, it makes sense, because no country wants to wait until a threat becomes irreversible. But that's only the surface. History shows a pattern. The reason that starts a war is rarely the only force behind it. There are layers, strategic interests, regional influence, long-term positioning, things you don't see in headlines but shape decisions anyway. And once a conflict begins, those layers don't disappear, they grow. In the Middle East, influence is everything. Who controls what? Who aligns with who? Who gains leverage and who loses it? For decades, US-Iran tension was never just one issue. It's power, reach, balance. So when conflict happens, it doesn't stay contained. It connects to everything. And then there's the part people avoid, the economic layer. Not theories, patterns. When conflict rises, markets react. Oil moves, supply chains shift, pressure spreads. That doesn't mean war starts because of this, but once it starts, the impact goes far beyond the battlefield, farther than most people expect. So now, you're not looking at one reason, you're looking at a system, security, power, economics, all real, all connected. And that's where it gets complicated, because when everything matters, it becomes harder to see what actually matters most, and easier to accept the version that's simplest to believe. And maybe that's the real issue. Not that the reasons are wrong, but that they're incomplete. Because once a war has multiple drivers, it stops being questioned. It just keeps moving, even when people aren't fully sure why anymore. And if that's true, then the real question isn't just why it started, but who benefits if it never really stops. Because once you follow what gains, the story stops looking simple. You've heard this before. The media is biased. Some say it leans, others say it shapes everything. Agree or not, That idea is already in your head. And once it's there, you don't just watch the news anymore. You filter it. But here's what most people miss. By the time you think you're forming your own opinion, the frame may have already been set. Research shows something uncomfortable. First impressions stick, even when corrections come later, which means the first version of a story doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be first. Because once it lands, it stays. Corrections don't replace it, they chase it. The same event, different headlines, different angles. Some highlight security, others highlight risk. Same facts, different meaning. And over time, it stops feeling like one reality seen differently and starts feeling like two realities that can't even recognize each other. Look at the public response. Split. Some call it necessary strength, others call it too much power. Same decision, opposite reactions. And this is where it shifts, because when power feels justified to one side, it feels dangerous to the other. And once that line is crossed, trust doesn't fade, it cracks. You've probably seen phrases like, "no king." Not about titles, about control. About how much power feels too much. Some call it overreaction, others call it a warning. But either way, it reveals something deeper. Trust is no longer shared. So step back. A war with more than one explanation. A public that can't agree. A narrative that shifts depending on where you stand. So here's the question people don't ask out loud. Are you seeing the full picture, or just the version that reached you first? Because once something feels true, it doesn't need to be proven. It just needs to be believed. And when that happens, truth doesn't disappear. It just gets harder to recognize. And when you can't recognize what's true anymore, you don't just lose clarity, you lose control of what you believe. At some point, war stops being strategy and starts showing up in real life. Not in headlines, not in statements, in prices, in uncertainty. Because when conflict rises, markets react, energy shifts, supply chains tighten, and people far from the battlefield start paying for decisions they never made. Economic reports show a pattern. Conflict brings volatility. Oil moves, transport costs rise, inflation builds, and it doesn't stay at the top. It drops into rent, into food, into survival. So ask yourself, is this the cost of security, or a burden carried by people who never chose it? And then there's the part you don't feel through numbers. People, civilians, displacement, lives interrupted. Numbers get reported, but the weight behind them doesn't. So when people debate war, what are they really debating? And wars like this don't stay contained. History shows once escalation starts, it spreads. Alliances react, responses build, and one decision turns into something much harder to control. And this is where it splits. Some say act now before it gets worse. Others say wait, or you create the very instability you fear. Same situation, opposite conclusions, and both sides sound convincing. So now you're left with this: a war that doesn't stay in one place, costs that reach people who didn't decide it, consequences that don't stay predictable, and a debate where both sides feel right. So what do? Support it because it might prevent something worse, or question it because it might already be creating it? Because once the consequences become real, this stops being distant. It gets closer than people expected. And if the cost keeps rising, the question isn't just whether it's justified, but how far it's allowed to go. At this point, this isn't just about war anymore. It's about something more uncomfortable. What you believe and why you believe it. Because by now, you've heard the arguments, and whether you realize it or not, you've already picked a side. But here's the question most people avoid. Did you choose that side, or did it choose you? through headlines, through clips, through fragments of a much bigger story. Because if two people can see the same reality and walk away with opposite truths, then the issue isn't just what happened, it's what made it make sense to you. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because changing your mind doesn't feel like learning. It feels like losing. So people double down, not always because they're right, but because stepping back feels worse than being wrong. So ask yourself this: what if the side you defend isn't completely right, and the side you reject isn't completely wrong? What if reality is more complicated than what you're willing to accept? Because in the end, war doesn't just test governments, it tests you, your judgment, your certainty, your willingness to question what feels true. And maybe the real risk isn't choosing wrong, but defending something before you fully understand it. So here's the question, not about Iran, not about the US, about you. If the version you believe in is incomplete, would you want to know? Or would you defend it anyway? Because once a belief feels true, it stops being information. It becomes identity, and questioning it feels like questioning yourself. So be honest, are you searching for the truth or just protecting what already feels right? And that might be the most dangerous part of all.